My name is Ellery Hatch. I'm 26 years old. And for 2.5 years, my parents called every single company I applied to and told them I was a convicted felon. I have never been arrested. I have never been charged with anything. I have never so much as gotten a speeding ticket. But by the time I was 25, I was sleeping on an air mattress in my coworker's laundry room, rationing a box of granola bars, and watching job offer after job offer disappear within 48 hours of being made. Every single time. Like clockwork. Like someone was watching. Someone was. My father, Ellery Hatch, spent 22 years as a shift supervisor at the Hollis bottling plant outside of Bowling Green, Kentucky. He knew how to manage things. He knew how to manage people. And for most of my life he managed me the same way he managed his production floor. With quotas. With expectations. And with consequences for anyone who stepped out of line. He never needed to raise his voice to make a room feel smaller. He just had to walk into it. My mother, Gloria, was softer on the surface. She brought casseroles to sick neighbors. She sang in the church choir every third Sunday. She called herself a homemaker with the kind of pride that made it sound like a title she'd earned in a difficult war. But soft people can do hard things when they believe they're doing them for the right reasons. And Ellery Hatch always believed she was doing things for the right reasons. That belief was the most dangerous thing about her. Before I tell you what I found inside that storage unit, and trust me, you're going to want to hear every word of this, I want to ask you something first. If you've ever had someone in your life who smiled at you warmly while quietly burning your future to the ground, this story is for you. And if it hits close to home, please subscribe. I put everything into telling these stories honestly, and it means the world to know they're reaching the people who need them most. Now let me take you back to Bowling Green, Kentucky. Specifically to the house on Decker Lane where I grew up. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch, a backyard that smelled like cut grass and lighter fluid every Memorial Day. From the outside we looked like every other family on that street. Dad grilled on weekends. Mom kept a flower bed by the mailbox. I got decent grades, stayed out of trouble, and went to church on the Sundays that mattered. On paper the Hatch family was doing just fine. What you couldn't see from the street was the way the air changed the moment Cleo walked into a room. Not because he yelled. He almost never yelled. It was quieter than that, and in some ways that made it worse. It was the way he'd set his coffee mug down just a little too hard when something displeased him. The way he'd go completely silent at dinner and let that silence do the work that words would have been too obvious for. The way Gloria would catch my eye across the table and give me the smallest shake of her head that meant don't push it tonight. I learned early that keeping the peace in that house was a full-time job, and it had always been mine. I wasn't allowed a social media account until I was 19, and even then Cleo had the login. My paychecks from my part-time job at the Riverside Grill, where I waited tables all through high school, went into a joint account that Gloria managed. I never questioned it. That was just how things worked. I was told it was for savings. For my future. I believed that for longer than I should have. When I was 22 I got a job offer from a logistics company in Nashville. Entry-level coordinator position. But it was real work with a real salary, and it was 65 miles away from Decker Lane. I was so genuinely excited that I made the mistake of telling Gloria over dinner before I'd even signed the paperwork. She smiled wide and squeezed my hand. She passed the green beans. Cleo said nothing. He just cut his pork chop into smaller and smaller pieces and stared at his plate like the food had personally offended him. 3 days later the offer was rescinded. The HR coordinator called, apologetic but vague. Something had come to their attention during the final stages of the background check process. They wished me all the best. I remember sitting in my car in the Walgreens parking lot after that call, completely still, trying to figure out what could possibly have come up. I had no record. Nothing. I drove home confused and quietly embarrassed and told myself it was a mistake. These things happen. I would find something else. I found something else 3 months later. A property management company in Bowling Green, respectable salary, and a woman named Brenda who interviewed me twice and told me on the second visit that she was excited to bring me onto her team. I signed the offer letter on a Thursday. On the following Monday Brenda called me. Her voice was different. She said she'd received some information over the weekend she wasn't at liberty to discuss, but that the company would be going in another direction. He was sorry. He hoped I understood. I did not understand. But I was starting to feel the edges of something without a name. A pattern with no clear shape. A coincidence happening far too many times to still be called coincidence. I applied to 6 more positions over the following 8 months. A regional bank, a hospital administration office, a marketing firm that had found my resume on Indeed, a distribution center on the south side of town, a dental office, and a small family-owned insurance agency on the edge of Bowling Green. I got interviews at 5. Offers from 3. And every single offer, without exception, was pulled back within 72 hours. No real explanation. No specifics. Just a carefully worded email or an uncomfortable phone call and the hollow sound of another door swinging shut. By month 10 I was unraveling in ways I was working hard not to show. I couldn't sleep. I was spending money I didn't have on gas and interview clothes and the kind of hope that gets more expensive every time it doesn't pay off. I started keeping a list in my phone. Every company, every date, every offer, every rescission. Because something in me, some quiet, stubborn instinct I'd spent years being trained to ignore, was telling me to document everything. I didn't know then how critical that list would become. What finally cracked it open wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a tearful confession. It was a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October when I ran into a woman named Sherry Dodd at the Kroger on Scottsville Road. Sherry had worked in HR at the regional bank that pulled my offer back in the spring. When she spotted me in the produce section, her face did something complicated. Something caught halfway between recognition and discomfort. She looked like a woman deciding whether to say something she probably shouldn't. I made it easy for her. I asked directly, keeping my voice casual like it was just small talk. I said I always wondered what happened with that position. She glanced down the aisle and then leaned in slightly. Off the record, she said someone had called their office. A man. He identified himself as a former employer of mine. He said I had been let go for stealing from the register and that criminal charges had been filed but dropped because the business owner didn't want the hassle of court. She looked at me carefully and asked if any of that was true. I told her no. Not a single word of it. She nodded slowly with the look of someone who had already suspected as much. He said she was sorry. She said HR departments get those calls and can't always verify, and it puts everyone in an impossible position. I thanked her. I put a bag of apples in my cart. I walked to the end of the aisle. And then I stood in front of a wall of canned tomatoes for 2 full minutes without moving, because the world had just shifted underneath me in a way I could feel in my chest. A man. Claiming to be a former employer. Stealing from a register. This was not a background check error or a clerical glitch. Someone was picking up a phone and lying about me with enough detail and enough confidence to be believed. And the only man in my life with the specific combination of motive, time, and absolute certainty that he was justified in doing whatever it took to keep me exactly where he wanted me was sitting on the covered porch on Decker Lane at this very moment, reading his folded newspaper like a man who had never done a dishonest thing in his life. I drove home, pulled into the driveway and sat in my car without moving. Cleo was on the porch exactly where I knew he would be. He raised one hand in a slow, easy wave when he saw my headlights. Come. Unhurried. Gloria's voice drifted through the screen door, something about supper being ready. I waved back. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table and I made a decision so quiet it barely registered as a decision at all. I was done guessing. I was going to find out exactly what was happening. And whatever it cost me, I was going to do something about it. I just had no idea yet how far back it went. Or how carefully it had all been arranged. Or what I was going to uncover once I finally started looking in the right places. I want to tell you what it feels like to suspect your own father of something like this, because it is not what you would expect. It is not rage, at least not at first. It is something quieter and much harder to sit with. It is the feeling of standing in a house you grew up in and realizing that the walls you always thought were holding you up were actually holding you in. That the protection you were raised to be grateful for was never really about you at all. I did not confront Cleo that night. I had nothing concrete yet, just a second-hand account from a woman in a grocery store aisle and 2.5 years of closed doors I had never been able to explain. I needed more than a feeling. I needed something I could hold in my hands. So I did what I had learned to do growing up in that house. I went quiet. I went still. And I started paying attention in a way I never had before. The first thing I did was call every company that had rescinded an offer. I told each one I was following up to understand the decision, that I was trying to improve my candidacy for future roles. Most of them wouldn't say much. HR departments are trained to say as little as possible. But 3 of them, 3 out of 8, gave me something. Not details exactly, but a shape. One hiring manager said they had received a reference call they hadn't requested. Another said a concern had been raised through an outside contact. The third one, a woman at the distribution center, said something that stopped me cold. She said the man who called had been very specific. That he knew my previous job titles. That he knew the name of my high school. That he sounded like someone who knew me personally. He knew my job titles. He knew my high school. I had listed both of those things on my resume. And the only people who had unrestricted access to my resume were the people I had been sending it from, because for the first 8 months of my job search before I finally opened my own email account, I had been using the family desktop computer in the hallway. The one Cleo used every evening to pay bills. The one that was never locked. The one where my documents were saved in a folder labeled Ellery Career, sitting right there on the desktop for anyone to open. I drove to the Bowling Green Public Library the following morning and used one of their public computers to go back through every application I had submitted. I cross-referenced dates. I mapped out every rescission against every application I had sent from that family computer versus the ones I had sent later from my phone after getting my own email. The pattern was immediate and absolute. Every single rescission tied back to a position I had applied for during that first stretch, when my resume was sitting open and accessible on that desktop. The 3 applications I had sent from my phone alone after I had quietly started using my own account had resulted in 2 offers that progressed further than anything before them, and both had eventually been pulled after I made the mistake of mentioning them at dinner. I sat in the library for a long time after I figured that out. A woman 2 tables over was helping her kid with a school project, something about the water cycle. The librarian was reshelving a cart of returns. Everything around me was completely ordinary. And I was sitting there understanding with total clarity that my father had been reading my job applications, writing down the names of companies, and then calling those companies to destroy me before I ever had a chance. I thought about every dinner table conversation I had ever made the mistake of having. Every time I mentioned an interview and watched Cleo nod along in that flat, unreadable way of his. Every time Gloria said something encouraging that felt slightly rehearsed. I had been handing them the map and they had been using it to close every road ahead of me before I could take a single step. When I got home that evening, I walked straight to the hallway computer. Cleo was in the living room watching the news. Gloria was in the kitchen. I moved quietly, opened the browser history and scrolled back as far as it would go. Most of it was ordinary. Weather. Local news. A few searches about retirement accounts. But then, buried between a search for auto parts and a grocery store circular, I found it. A search for Meridian Logistics Nashville HR department contact. Meridian Logistics was the company in Nashville. The first offer. The one rescinded 3 days after I told Gloria about it at dinner. I kept scrolling. County line distribution contact number. Hargrove Property Management HR Bowling Green. Blue Peak Insurance Group hiring contact Kentucky. Every single company. Searched from this computer. Dated within 48 hours of my applications going out. My hands were steady on the keyboard but my jaw was clamped so tight my back teeth ached. I took photos of the screen with my phone. Every search. Every date. Then I closed the browser, walked to the kitchen and told Gloria the pasta smelled good. She beamed. She asked if I wanted garlic bread. I said yes please. I sat down at the table across from Cleo and I ate dinner and I did not say a single word about what I had just found. That was the hardest meal I have ever sat through in my life. Cleo talked about a problem with one of the neighbors' drainage ditches. Gloria mentioned that the Whitfield girl down the street had just gotten engaged. I nodded at the right moments. I refilled my water glass. And the whole time I was thinking about that browser history and the specific deliberate searches and the careful architecture of what my father had been doing for years while presenting himself to this entire town as a reasonable, quiet, devoted family man. The next morning I called my Aunt Vera, my mother's older sister, who had moved to Louisville 12 years ago after a falling out with Gloria that nobody in our family had ever been willing to explain to me directly. Vera picked up on the second ring and when I told her what I had found she went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Ellery, I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." Vera told me that when she was still living in Bowling Green before the falling out, she had watched Cleo do the same thing to Gloria's younger brother, Dale. Dale had been offered a management position at a company in Elizabethtown and had made the mistake of telling Cleo about it at a family cookout. 2 weeks later the offer was gone and Dale had never been able to get a straight answer about why. Vera had always suspected Cleo but had no proof, and Gloria had refused to hear a word against him. That was the falling out. Vera had pushed too hard and Gloria had made her choose, and Vera had chosen the truth over the relationship. I did not speak for a moment after she told me that. Then I asked her how long she thought this had been going on. She said she honestly did not know, but that Cleo Hatch was not a man who started doing something the first time you caught him. He was a man who had been doing something for years before anyone thought to look. I drove back to the library that afternoon. I needed to think somewhere that was not that house. I sat at the same table I had used the day before, and I opened my phone and I looked at the list I had been keeping for almost a year. Every company, every date, every offer, every rescission. I added the browser history screenshots. I added what Sherry Dodd had told me at the Kroger. I added what Vera had just told me about Dale. I added the pattern I had mapped between the family computer and my rescission dates. Then I looked at all of it laid out together, and I understood something that I think part of me had been refusing to understand for a long time. This was not impulsive. This was not Cleo having a bad moment and making one terrible decision. This was a system. It was deliberate, it was sustained, and it had been running quietly in the background of my entire adult life like a machine Cleo had built specifically to make sure I never got far enough away from Decker Lane to figure out what he was doing. He had not been protecting me. He had been farming me. Keeping me close, keeping me dependent, keeping me small enough to manage. And Gloria had either known and said nothing, or had looked away with enough intention that the difference barely mattered. I sat with that for a long time. The librarian eventually asked if I needed anything, and I said no thank you, and she moved on. Outside the window, Bowling Green went about its afternoon. Cars pulling in and out of the lot. A woman with a stroller. 2 teenagers on bikes. Everything moving and ordinary and completely indifferent to the fact that I was sitting at a library table quietly understanding that the 2 people who were supposed to be my foundation had spent years being the exact reason I could not stand up. I was not going to cry about it. I had done enough of that alone in Josie's laundry room at 2 in the morning, wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't hold a job offer, why every door seemed to close before I could walk through it. There was nothing wrong with me. There had never been anything wrong with me. And now I had a list, screenshots, a witness, and a pattern that was clear enough to follow. What I needed next was someone who knew what to do with all of it. What I did not know yet was that someone had already been watching. And they had been watching for much longer than I had. Her name was Dottie Crane. She was 58 years old, drove a tan Buick with a dented rear bumper, and she had been sitting in the parking lot of the Bowling Green Public Library for the better part of 3 Tuesday afternoons before she finally walked through the front door and asked the librarian which table was mine. I did not know any of that when she sat down across from me. I just looked up from my phone and saw a woman I had never met in my life pulling out the chair on the opposite side of the table like she had been expecting to find me there. She had short silver hair, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the kind of calm that does not come from having an easy life but from having survived a hard one. She set a manila envelope on the table between us. She did not open it. She looked at me and said, "You're Ellery Hatch," and I said yes, and she said, "My name is Dottie Crane, and I was hired by your grandmother 18 months ago to find you when things got bad enough. I want you to know that in her opinion and in mine things are bad enough." I stared at her. I said, "My grandmother has been dead for 4 years. And Dottie said, "I know. She hired me 2 years before she passed. She planned for this specifically. She planned for you." My grandmother's name was Ruth Elaine Hatch. Everyone called her Miss Rue, which she hated but tolerated because she said you could not fight a nickname once it had taken root in a small town. You could only outlive it. She had lived her entire life in Warren County, raised 4 kids on a teacher's salary after my grandfather walked out when Cleo was 11, and spent the last decade of her life in a small house on Eastwood Drive that smelled like cedar and black coffee and the particular kind of quiet that belongs to people who have made their peace with being alone. She and I were close in the way that skips a generation sometimes. Cleo tolerated her the way controlling people tolerate anyone who sees through them, which is to say barely and only when necessary. But Miss Rue had a way of getting me alone when she wanted to. A drive to the farmer's market. A Sunday afternoon on her porch with sweet tea and dominoes. And in those spaces away from Decker Lane she would talk to me like I was a full person with a future and opinions and choices, which was more than anyone else in my life was doing at the time. The last real conversation I had with her was about a year before she died. We were sitting on her porch and she asked me how the job search was going, and I told her about Nashville, and she went very quiet in the way she did when she was deciding how much to say. Then she looked out at the street and said, "Ellery, if it ever gets to the point where you cannot figure out why the doors keep closing, I want you to know that someone will come explain it to you. Don't be frightened when they do." I remember laughing a little and saying, "Grandma, what are you talking about?" And she said, "I know my son. I've known him since he was born and I have spent 50 years watching him and I know exactly what he is capable of when he is afraid of losing something he thinks belongs to him." I had filed that conversation under things old women say that you don't fully understand until later. I understood it now. Dottie slid the manila envelope across the table. She said I could open it or she could walk me through it, whichever I preferred. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter on pale blue stationery in my grandmother's looping, unhurried cursive. I recognized it immediately. She had written my birthday cards in that same hand my entire life. The letter said this: "Ellery, if you are reading this, then Dottie has found you and things have gotten hard. I am sorry I could not stop it while I was here. I tried talking to your father twice in the last years of my life and both times he looked at me the way he has always looked at anyone who challenges him, like the conversation is already over and he is simply waiting for you to figure that out. I knew then that talking would not be enough. So I stopped talking and I started planning. Inside this envelope you will find what I was able to put together. Use it however you need to. You do not owe anyone an explanation for surviving. I love you more than I ever found the right moment to say out loud. Miss Rue." I set the letter down on the table. My throat was tight. Dottie waited without saying anything, which I appreciated more than I could express. Then I looked at the rest of what was in the envelope. Dottie had been doing more than watching. For 18 months she had been documenting. She had a contact at the county courthouse, a woman who processed civil records and had agreed to flag anything connected to the Hatch name. She had a retired telephone company employee who owed her a favor and had helped her pull outgoing call logs from the landline at Decker Lane through legal channels that I did not fully understand but that Dottie said would hold up if it came to that. And it had come to that. The call logs were printed on 4 pages and highlighted in yellow. 31 outgoing calls from the Decker Lane landline to phone numbers that Dottie had traced to the HR departments or main lines of companies I had applied to. 31 calls over 26 months. Each one dated. Each one annotated in Dottie's neat, careful handwriting with the name of the company it corresponded to and the date my application had gone in. I looked at that list for a long time. 31 calls. I had found 8 rescissions on my own. I had suspected Cleo. But 31 calls across 26 months meant this had started earlier than I realized, before I ever had a name for what was happening, before I even knew to be suspicious, back when I was still telling myself that sometimes these things just didn't work out. Dottie told me there was something else. She reached into the envelope and pulled out a smaller sealed document, a single folded page with the name of a law firm printed across the top. Aldridge and Pell, Attorneys at Law, Bowling Green, Kentucky. She said my grandmother had made an appointment with them 8 months before she died. She had not told anyone. She had driven herself to that appointment alone, sat down with a junior partner named Marcus Webb, and spent 2 hours explaining what she believed her son was doing and what she wanted in place to address it when the time came. Marcus Webb had agreed to take the case on contingency if and when Ellery Hatch was ready to bring it forward. That agreement had been sitting in a file at Aldridge and Pell for 4 years, waiting. I looked up at Dottie. I said she did all of this while she was sick. Because Miss Rue had been managing a heart condition for the last 3 years of her life. She had known her time was limited and she had spent part of that limited time in a lawyer's office making sure I would not be left without a next step. Dottie said she was very clear about one thing. She said to tell you that she was not doing this out of anger at your father. She said she had already made her peace with who Cleo was. He was doing it out of love for you. She wanted you to have options. She wanted you to have a name on a door you could knock on when you were ready. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I asked Dottie what she thought I should do. She said that was not her call to make, that her job had been to find me and give me what Miss Rue had left for me and that everything from this point was mine to decide. But she said one more thing before she stood up to leave. She said, "For what it's worth, I've watched your father for 18 months. I've watched the way he runs that house and I've watched what he does when he thinks no one is looking. Your grandmother was right about him. And you are not crazy for having felt it your entire life." She picked up her bag and left. The tan Buick was gone from the parking lot by the time I walked outside. I sat in my own car for a while. The afternoon had gone gray, the kind of flat Kentucky overcast that makes everything look like it is waiting for something. I held the envelope in my lap and I thought about Miss Rue driving herself to a law office while her heart was failing and sitting across from a stranger and methodically laying out the case for her granddaughter's future. I thought about her on the porch on Eastwood Drive in her last years, moving slowly but thinking clearly, watching everything and saying very little. She had seen what was coming before I was old enough to see it myself. And she had done the only thing she could do from where she was standing. She had built me a door and left it unlocked and trusted that eventually I would find it. I started the car. I had a name and I had a number and I had a file full of evidence and a law firm that had been waiting 4 years to hear from me. And for the first time in 2.5 years I did not feel like someone standing outside every room wondering why the handle kept slipping out of my hand. I felt like someone who had just been handed a key. What happened when I walked into that law office the following morning was something I was not entirely prepared for. Because it turned out that Marcus Webb had not been sitting idle for 4 years. And neither had the evidence. Aldridge and Pell occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building on College Street, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and an insurance agency that had been there since before I was born. The staircase was steep and the carpet was the kind of dark green that had probably looked professional in 1994. I climbed it on a Wednesday morning with my grandmother's envelope under my arm and the specific kind of nerves that come not from fear but from standing at the edge of something that cannot be undone once it begins. Marcus Webb was younger than I expected. Mid-30s, close-cropped hair, a gray suit jacket over an open collar. He shook my hand at the door and looked at the envelope and said, "I was wondering when you would come in." He said it the way someone says something they have been rehearsing for a long time and are relieved to finally get to say out loud. He had kept the file active for 4 years. He showed it to me, a thick expandable folder with my name written on the tab in black marker and the date of my grandmother's initial appointment stamped in the upper corner. Inside was everything Miss Rue had told him during that 2-hour meeting, typed up in clean, organized notes. She had been thorough in a way that still made my chest ache when I thought about it. She had described Cleo's patterns going back years. The way he had managed her own finances when she was briefly ill a decade ago and she'd had to fight to get control of her own accounts back. The way he had cut off Gloria from her sister Vera after Vera had asked too many questions. The way every person in his immediate orbit who tried to move independently eventually found that independence blocked by some obstacle they couldn't quite name or trace back to him. She had also told Marcus something I had not known. 3 years before my job search began, Cleo had quietly contacted the HR department of a company where my cousin Delia had been offered a position. Delia had blamed herself for years when that offer collapsed. Miss Rue had suspected Cleo but had no proof. She told Marcus because she wanted him to understand this was not a single event. It was a method Cleo had been refining for years before he ever turned it on me. Marcus spread everything across the conference table. My documentation from the library, the screenshots of the browser history, the list from my phone, the call logs Dottie had assembled, and now the foundational notes from 4 years ago that gave all of it a history and a context. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "In Kentucky, tortious interference with prospective employment is a recognized cause of action. Defamation per se applies when someone falsely states that a person has committed a crime. You do not have to prove damages to bring that claim, though we have damages. We have 2.5 years of them." He said he wanted to bring in a colleague named Janet Osei who handled employment litigation. She would review everything and if she agreed the case was as solid as he believed, they would move quickly. He said one more thing before I left that afternoon. He said, "I want you to understand that going forward with this will be uncomfortable. Your father will be served. It will become a matter of public record. People who know your family will find out. Are you prepared for that?" I told him I had been sleeping on an air mattress in a laundry room for 7 months because of what my father had done to me. I was prepared for uncomfortable. Janet Osei came in the following Monday. She was 44, precise and economical, the kind of person who made you feel that every word she used had been chosen deliberately over several alternatives. She reviewed the full file in 2 hours. She asked me 23 questions, I counted, and then she closed her legal pad and said, "We file within the week." The lawsuit named Cleo Hatch as the primary defendant on 2 counts. Defamation per se for falsely and repeatedly representing to prospective employers that Ellery Hatch had a criminal record. And tortious interference with prospective employment, for the deliberate and sustained campaign of contact designed to prevent me from obtaining work. The complaint was detailed and specific. It named 8 companies, cited the call logs, referenced the browser history screenshots, and included the statement from Sherry Dodd as a supporting declaration. Cleo was served on a Friday afternoon. The process server caught him in the driveway of Decker Lane while he was unloading groceries from the bed of his truck. I was not there and did not need to be. Janet called that evening to confirm it was done. Cleo had taken the documents inside without a word. I imagine that silence cost him something. Cleo Hatch had spent his entire adult life being the one who made things happen to other people. Having something happen to him was a different kind of experience entirely. By Sunday the calls started. Not to me. To Vera in Louisville, to Delia, to two neighbors on Decker Lane who had known our family for years. Gloria made most of them. She was working the phones the same way she had always managed difficult situations in our family, by getting to everyone first, by setting the narrative before anyone had a chance to read the actual document. She told Vera that I had been manipulated by a lawyer. She told Delia that the lawsuit was full of lies. She told the neighbors that I had always been difficult, that I had struggled with instability, that they were worried about my mental health. Vera called me after Gloria's call and said, "Ellery, she told me you fabricated the browser history." I said, "Gloria is welcome to explain to a judge how I fabricated call logs pulled from the Decker Lane landline by a licensed investigator." Vera was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I'll be available to testify if you need me." I wrote that down. What Gloria had not accounted for was that the lawsuit was filed in Warren County Circuit Court and that court filings in Kentucky are public record. Within 10 days of the filing, people in Bowling Green were reading the complaint. Not because I shared it. I shared nothing. I said nothing publicly. I did not post anything on social media. I did not call a single person to tell my side of the story. The document did that entirely on its own. By the end of the second week, Brenda from the property management company had called Janet's office. She said she still had the voicemail from the weekend my offer was rescinded. A message she had saved without knowing why, from a man who identified himself as Ellery Hatch's former supervisor. She had saved it because something about it had felt off and she had never gotten around to deleting it. She said she was willing to hand it over. Janet drove to her office that same afternoon. The voicemail was 43 seconds long. Cleo's voice, unmistakably, because I listened to the recording Janet sent me and I had grown up in a house with that voice for 22 years. He said he was a former manager of mine from a warehouse position I had held before coming to Bowling Green. He said I had been terminated for theft and that charges had been filed. His tone was measured and regretful, the tone of a man performing reluctant civic duty. It was the most chilling thing I had ever heard because it sounded so reasonable, so concerned. So completely and deliberately false. Janet filed the voicemail as Exhibit A. She called it the cleanest piece of evidence she had seen in 4 years of employment litigation. Cleo hired an attorney from Elizabethtown, a man named Purcell who had a website that listed his practice areas in a font that had not been updated since the early 2000s. Purcell sent a letter suggesting the browser history screenshots were circumstantial and that the call logs did not conclusively establish what was said during those calls. Janet wrote back a single paragraph noting that the voicemail did establish the content of at least one call, that Dottie Crane's documentation established a consistent pattern across 31 contacts, and that she looked forward to presenting all of it in front of a jury of Warren County residents who might have opinions about a man who spent 2.5 years lying to HR departments to keep his adult daughter unemployed. Purcell called back the following day and used the word settlement for the first time. I was sitting in my car outside the Aldridge and Pell building when Janet called to tell me. I had started parking there some mornings because it was quiet and it was not the laundry room and it was not Decker Lane, and those were the only criteria I had for a good place to think. She said Purcell had floated the idea of a private resolution. She said it was my decision entirely whether to entertain it or proceed to court. She said both had merit depending on what I wanted the outcome to look like. I asked her what she thought the difference was. She said a settlement would be faster, quieter, money in my hands within months. Court would be slower, more public, and would put everything in front of a judge and potentially a jury, becoming permanent record in a way a private settlement would not. I told her I needed 24 hours. He said take the time you need. I sat in that parking lot for a while longer after we hung up. The dry cleaner next door had a sign in the window advertising same-day service. A woman walked past with a Yorkshire Terrier on a very long leash. Bowling Green did what Bowling Green always did, which was continue existing without any particular awareness of what was happening inside the lives of the people moving through it. I thought about Miss Rue driving herself to this building while her heart was running out of time. I thought about what she had written. You do not owe anyone an explanation for surviving. I thought about Cleo and his slow, easy wave from the porch, calm as a man who had never been caught. I picked up my phone and called Janet back before the 24 hours were up. I told her I did not want a quiet resolution. I told her I wanted the public record. She said, I was hoping you would say that. We go to court. The trial date was set for a Thursday in March. Warren County Circuit Court, Courtroom B, 9 in the morning. I had never been inside a courtroom in my life. I had spent 2.5 years being described as someone with a criminal history, and I had never once stood in front of a judge. There was something almost absurd about that, something that I tried not to think about too hard in the weeks leading up to it, because if I let myself feel the full weight of the irony, I was not sure I would be able to hold myself together long enough to walk through the door. Janet had prepared me thoroughly. We met 4 times in the 2 weeks before the hearing. She walked me through the sequence of events, what would be presented, what Purcell was likely to argue, how I should sit and when I should speak, and what I should do when Cleo was in the same room, which was to look at the evidence and not at him. She said juries and judges both notice when a plaintiff spends the whole trial staring at the defendant. She said it reads as unresolved emotion, and she needed me to read as resolved. I practiced that. I practiced it alone in Josie's bathroom in the mornings, looking at myself in the mirror and keeping my face still. I had been managing my expressions in that house my whole childhood. I could do it for one day in a courtroom. Cleo showed up without Purcell. Purcell had withdrawn from the case 10 days before the hearing after Cleo declined to follow his advice about settlement and then stopped returning his calls. So Cleo walked into courtroom B alone in his good blue shirt, the one Gloria ironed for serious occasions, carrying a manila folder that I later learned contained a 2-page handwritten statement he intended to read to the judge. He had represented himself in court with a handwritten statement and a shirt his wife had pressed for him. I do not say that to be cruel. I say it because it tells you everything you need to know about how certain Cleo Hatch was that the world would simply take his word for things. Gloria was in the gallery. She sat in the second row with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged into an expression of dignified suffering that I recognized from every difficult moment of my childhood. Vera was also there. She had driven down from Louisville the night before and was sitting 3 rows behind Gloria with her arms crossed and an expression that was its own complete statement. Janet had told me that Vera's presence alone, the fact that Gloria's own sister had driven 4 hours to sit on the other side of the room, was going to register with the judge before a single word was spoken. The evidence came in cleanly. Janet was methodical and unhurried. She presented the call logs first, walked the judge through the highlighted entries one by one, each call dated and traced to a specific company on a specific date within 48 hours of my application. Then the browser history screenshots, each search query tied to a company name and time-stamped. Then the voicemail, which the judge listened to through a small speaker on the evidence table. 43 seconds of Cleo's voice, measured and regretful and completely fabricated, filling that quiet courtroom like something that had been waiting a long time to be heard by the right people. The judge asked to hear it twice. Janet played it twice. The second time I watched the judge's face and I watched something settle there. A particular quality of stillness that I had learned from 4 meetings with Janet to read as the expression of someone who has stopped weighing the evidence and started deciding. Sherry Dodd testified by deposition, her statement read into the record by Janet. Brenda testified in person, briefly and directly, confirming the voicemail and the timeline of my rescinded offer. Vera testified about what she had witnessed during the years she lived in Bowling Green, about the falling out with Gloria, about what Miss Rue had told her privately in the last year of her life about her fears for me. Vera's voice was steady the entire time. She had been waiting 12 years to say some of what she said in that room, and it showed in the way she said it, not with anger but with the particular precision of someone who has had a very long time to get the words exactly right. Cleo was given time to present his case. He stood up, opened his manila folder and read his statement. He said the lawsuit was the result of a misunderstanding. He said the calls, which he did not directly acknowledge making, were made out of concern for my welfare. He said he had reason to believe I was making poor decisions and that he had acted as any father would act when worried about his child. He said he had never intended to harm me. He said the family had always had my best interests at heart. He said my name 4 times during that statement. Each time he said it the way he always had, flattened and declarative, The way you say a word you own rather than a name that belongs to someone else. I looked at the evidence table the entire time he spoke. I did not look at him once. The judge did not ask Cleo many questions. She asked him one. She said, "Mr. Hatch, the call log shows 31 outgoing calls from your home landline to the HR departments of companies your daughter applied to over a period of 26 months. Can you explain those calls?" Cleo said he did not recall making that many calls. The judge looked at him for a moment and then wrote something on the notepad in front of her and did not ask him anything else. I had been in that courtroom for 4 hours and 20 minutes when the judge delivered her ruling. She found in my favor on both counts. Defamation per se tortious interference with prospective employment. She noted in her ruling that the evidence was extensive, consistent, and credible, and that the defendant had offered no substantive rebuttal to any of it. She awarded damages of $94,000, calculated from documented lost income across 2.5 years, the cost of the investigators' retained services as recoverable damages under the tortious interference claim, and additional amounts for what she described as the sustained and deliberate nature of the conduct. $94,000. I had been living on granola bars and borrowed floor space. I sat in that chair and heard that number and I did not cry. I want to be clear about that because what I felt in that moment was not the kind of thing that comes out as tears. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a pressure that has been building for years, finding somewhere to go. Cleo did not react visibly when the ruling was read. He closed his manila folder and sat still for a moment and then stood up and walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. Gloria followed him, her heels clicking on the floor, her face still arranged in that expression of dignified suffering that had not changed once during the entire 4 hours we had been in the same room. Vera was waiting for me in the hallway outside. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. Janet shook my hand and said she would begin enforcement proceedings immediately. I thanked her. I thanked Marcus. I walked out of the Warren County Courthouse into a pale March afternoon and stood on the steps for a moment and breathed. The ruling was a matter of public record. By that evening, it was the only thing anyone in Bowling Green was talking about. The Bowling Green Daily News ran a brief item the following morning. Local civil case, defamation ruling, daughter awarded $94,000 against father. Short, factual, no editorial comment needed. Facts in cases like this do not require editorializing. The cooking group that had quietly asked Gloria to take a break did not invite her back. The neighbors on Decker Lane, the ones Gloria had called the Sunday after the lawsuit was filed to tell them I had fabricated everything, stopped waving from their driveways. Tom Adler, who had known Cleo for 20 years and attended every neighborhood cookout the Hatch family had ever hosted, knocked on the door of Decker Lane 3 days after the ruling. He asked Cleo a single question. Cleo did not answer it. He closed the door. Tom Adler did not knock again. Cleo could not pay the judgment outright. He had a pension and a mortgage and the kind of finances that look stable until they are required to absorb a 6-figure court judgment all at once. Janet filed a lien on the Decker Lane property within 2 weeks of the ruling. The house went on the market 6 weeks after that. Not because Cleo wanted to sell. Because the lien made the mortgage situation untenable and the bank had its own opinions about how long that could continue. I did not drive past the house when it sold. I did not need to see it. I had not been back to Decker Lane since the morning I left with my grandmother's envelope under my arm and my hands steadier than I expected them to be. I did not need a closing image of that house to know that chapter was finished. Some endings do not require a witness. They just require you to stop going back. What I did do the week the sale closed was drive to Eastwood Drive. Miss Rue's house had new owners, a young couple with a bike rack on their car and a wind chime on the porch that she would have found excessive but tolerated. I parked across the street and sat for a few minutes. I did not go up to the door. I just sat there and thought about an old woman with a failing heart who had driven herself to a lawyer's office and spent 2 hours making sure her granddaughter would have somewhere to turn. I thought about the letter she had written on pale blue stationery. I thought about the last line. I love you more than I ever found the right moment to say out loud. I started the car. I had somewhere to be. The somewhere I had to be was a job interview. Not a desperate one, not the kind where you sit across from a stranger and spend the whole conversation trying to figure out if someone has already called ahead to ruin it. This one was different from the start. It was at a mid-sized accounting firm on State Street in Bowling Green called Harwell & Associates. They had found my resume through a referral from Marcus Webb, who had mentioned me to a colleague who had mentioned me to the firm's office manager. By the time I sat down across from a woman named Patricia Gaines, she already knew the broad outline of what had happened. Not because I had told her, but because the court ruling was public record and Patricia Gaines was the kind of office manager who did her research before interviews rather than during them. She did not ask me about the lawsuit. She asked me about my organizational skills, my experience with scheduling and document management, and whether I was comfortable working across multiple departments. I told her yes to all three. She offered me the position at the end of the meeting. Not pending a background check. Not subject to further review. At the end of the meeting, across the table with a handshake and a start date. I sat in my car afterward for a long time. Not because I was processing bad news this time. Just because I wanted to feel it fully before it became ordinary. A job offer that stayed. A door that opened and did not swing shut in the night while I was not looking. I had applied to 11 positions over 2.5 years and watched every single one collapse before I could walk through it. Now I was sitting in a parking lot on State Street in Bowling Green with a start date written on a sticky note and no reason in the world to believe it would disappear. I started at Harwell & Associates on a Monday. The office was on the 3rd floor, clean and quiet, with windows that faced west and caught the afternoon light in a way that made the whole room go gold around 4. Patricia introduced me to the staff. 7 people, first names, handshakes, the low-key friendliness of a workplace that runs well enough that nobody is performing camaraderie for survival. I had a desk with a monitor and a drawer that locked and a key that belonged to me. I want to tell you about that first week because people who have not come through something like this do not always understand what ordinary feels like when you have been kept from it long enough. Every morning I drove to work on roads I had driven my whole life and nothing felt the same. Not because anything had changed about the roads. As I had. I knew what it had cost to be sitting in that car on that route at that time with somewhere legitimate to be. I had the receipts, literally $94,000 worth of them entered in the court record of Warren County Circuit Court. The money came through in stages as the lien on the Decker Lane property was resolved through the sale. Janet walked me through each disbursement with the same methodical calm she had brought to every other part of the process. I put a portion into savings. I paid off the debt from the months I was unemployed and sleeping on borrowed space. I enrolled in an evening accounting course at Western Kentucky University because Patricia had mentioned the firm occasionally promoted from within and I had decided I was done letting other people decide what my ceiling was. I also did something I had not planned and did not fully understand until I was already doing it. I called Dottie Crane. Not for any professional reason. I called her because she was the person who had sat down across from me in a library and handed me my grandmother's letter and waited quietly while I read it. And that is the kind of thing a person does not forget. We had coffee at a diner on Fairview Avenue on a Saturday morning. She ordered black coffee and a slice of coconut cake and told me about a case she was currently working that she could not discuss and a dog she had recently adopted that she could. His name was Gerald, which I found either darkly funny or cosmically appropriate depending on how I thought about it. I chose cosmically appropriate. She asked how I was doing and I told her honestly. Sleeping through the night for the first time in years. A job, an apartment, a drawer that locked, a route to work nobody was trying to close off. Still figuring out what it felt like to make decisions without bracing for invisible consequences. She nodded like she understood that specifically. The legal resolution is one thing. The internal unwinding is another, and the second one takes longer and does not come with a court date. I asked her what Miss Rue had been like in those last years, during the appointments and the planning. Dottie thought about that for a moment. She said Miss Rue had been very calm. Not primarily bitter about Cleo. Focused. Like a woman who had identified a problem she could not solve directly and had decided to solve it indirectly instead, through preparation and patience and an absolute confidence that you would eventually find your way to the library on a Tuesday afternoon when the time was right. She said Miss Rue had told her one thing that she had been holding on to since the first day they met. She had said, I cannot change what my son is. But I can make sure that what he is does not get to be the end of her story. I held that for a long time after Dottie said it. I'm still holding it. I have not spoken to Cleo since the courtroom, or Gloria since before the lawsuit was filed. A letter arrived about 4 months after the Decker Lane sale, forwarded through Janet as the protection order required. It was from Gloria. It was 2 pages long and I will not describe it in detail because some things do not need to be repeated, but I will tell you that the word sorry appeared once in the entire letter and it appeared in the construction I am sorry you feel this way, which is not an apology but is occasionally disguised as one by people who need to believe they have offered one. I did not write back. I consulted Janet and she said I was under no legal or ethical obligation to respond and that if I did respond, any response should go through her office. I chose not to respond at all. I did not do that out of cruelty and I want to be clear about that, because I think there is a version of this story where the person who has been wronged is expected to eventually extend a hand and call it healing, and I have spent a long time thinking about whether that expectation is fair or whether it is just another form of the same pressure that kept me in that house on Decker Lane longer than I should have been. Here is what I have decided. Healing is real and it is necessary, and I am doing it slowly and imperfectly, the way most real things get done. But healing does not require an audience, and it does not require reconciliation, and it does not require me to make peace with people who have not yet made peace with the truth of what they did. What Gloria wrote in that letter was not the truth of what they did. It was a softer version arranged to be easier to live with. I understand why people do that. I am not interested in making it easier for them. What I am interested in, what I have become quietly and genuinely interested in over the course of this last year, is the question of what you build after. Not what you rebuild, because I am not trying to reconstruct something that was taken from me. I am trying to build something that never existed before, something that belongs entirely to the person I am now rather than the person I was managed into being on Decker Lane. So far that looks like this. A job I go to on weekdays where people use my name like it belongs to me. An evening class on Tuesday nights where I sit in the third row and take notes on things nobody has taught me before. An apartment with a west-facing window where the light comes in gold at 4 o'clock and a drawer that locks and a cat I have not gotten yet but am seriously considering. A phone that I pick up when I want to and set down when I do not. A life that is mine in the specific and irreplaceable way that things are yours when you have had to fight to get them. I think about Miss Rue most days. Not with grief anymore, or not only with grief. Mostly I think about her with a kind of gratitude that does not have a clean word for it in any language I know. She spent the last years of her life building me an exit from a situation she could see coming and I could not. She did it quietly, without telling anyone, without making it about herself, and she trusted me to find it when I was ready. That is a specific and extraordinary kind of love. The kind that does not announce itself. The kind that just shows up one Tuesday afternoon in a library and says, "Your grandmother hired me to find you," and then sits quietly while you read. I am 26 years old. I have a job and a drawer that locks and a court ruling in my name and a start date written on a sticky note that did not disappear. And somewhere in Warren County, there is a filing in the public record of a circuit court that says clearly and permanently exactly what Cleo Hatch did and exactly how it ended. He cannot call ahead and change that. He cannot rescind it. He cannot make it go away with a phone call from the house on Decker Lane, because there is no house on Decker Lane anymore. There is just the record. And the record does not take his calls. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.